Never corner a human. The old senator's voice carried across the Galactic Council chamber just seconds before the room erupted in laughter. Some delegates chuckled politely. Others laughed openly. At the center of it all, Warlord Karvek leaned back in his command throne and smiled the way powerful men do when they believe the universe has finally proven them right. "And what exactly happens if I do?" he asked. No one answered. The silence that followed should have bothered him. It did not. Karvek stood and slowly turned toward the massive star map floating above the chamber floor. Hundreds of systems glowed across the projection, but only one region held his attention. Sector Sol, humanity's frontier defenses, the last remaining pocket of resistance between his expanding armada and complete control of the outer reach. "The humans are finished," Karvek announced. "Their supply routes are gone. Their fleets are scattered. Their commander is trapped. By this time next week, they will either surrender or disappear." Several delegates nodded. It sounded reasonable. It sounded inevitable. After all, Karvek had never lost a campaign. For nearly 20 years, every system he targeted eventually folded. Every government eventually signed. Every rival eventually accepted reality. The council session ended shortly afterward, and across known space, news feeds repeated the same story. Humanity had finally run out of options. On the far edge of Terran-controlled space, nearly 300 light-years from Earth, Commander Mason Walker stared through the reinforced observation glass of Outpost Archer. Beyond the station, darkness stretched forever. Tiny stars flickered across the void. Somewhere inside that darkness waited Karvek's armada. Mason held a mug of coffee that had gone cold over an hour ago. He never noticed. "Updated inventory report," Sarah Brooks said as she stepped into the command center. She placed a tablet on the console beside him. "You don't want to see it." Mason glanced down. "That bad?" Sarah folded her arms. 3 days of food, if we're careful. For if we start cutting portions. Fuel reserves are below 20%. Long-range communications are barely working. Half our sensor grid is dead." Mason nodded slowly. "Anything else?" Sarah laughed quietly. "You know things are ugly when that's your response." Mason finally looked up. "What's the point of getting dramatic about numbers?" Sarah wanted to smile, but couldn't. Everyone aboard Archer understood the situation. The station had become an island surrounded by an ocean of enemies. Reinforcements weren't coming. Earth was too far away. The nearest Terran fleet was weeks out. "The crew is asking questions," Sarah said. "I know. They want to know if we're getting out of this." Mason stared back through the glass. "So do I." The answer hung between them. Neither said another word. Across the operations deck, technicians monitored failing systems. Maintenance crews worked double shifts. Pilots slept beside their flight gear because scramble alerts could happen at any moment. Nobody panicked, but everyone felt it. The pressure, the waiting, the uncertainty. Mason knew that feeling better than most. He had felt it years ago on another battlefield. Back before the promotions. Back before the gray in his hair. Back when he still believed preparation could prevent every disaster. His eyes drifted toward a framed photograph sitting beside the command console. A woman smiled back at him. Emily Walker, his wife. Gone for almost 12 years now. Some days the loss felt distant. Other days it felt like yesterday. Today was one of those days. Sarah noticed where he was looking, but said nothing. She had learned long ago that certain wounds did not need conversation. An alarm suddenly chimed across the room. Every head turned. A young sensor officer sat upright in his chair. "Commander," he called out. Multiple contacts just appeared at the outer boundary. Mason immediately stepped forward. The tactical display expanded across the room. Red markers filled the edge of the system map. Then more appeared. And more after that. The room fell silent. Nobody needed an explanation. They all knew exactly what they were looking at. Karvek had arrived. The Armada wasn't days away. It wasn't hours away. It was here. Mason studied the growing sea of red symbols without changing expression. Behind him, someone whispered a curse. Another officer quietly lowered his head. Sarah stared at the display and felt her stomach tighten. The enemy force was larger than their worst projections. For the first time all day, Mason finally spoke. "Get everyone to their stations." His voice remained calm. Almost too calm. Sarah looked at him. "Mason." He didn't take his eyes off the screen. "Let's get to work." Outside the station, thousands of hostile ships continued pouring into the system like a storm rolling across a dark horizon. Somewhere aboard the flagship, Warlord Karvek was probably smiling. He believed he had finally cornered a human. He had no idea what came next. Edit. The first 24 hours passed without a single shot being fired, and somehow that made everyone more nervous. Outpost archers sat in complete silence while Karvek's Armada tightened its grip around the system. Every major jump point was blocked. Every trade lane was monitored. Every possible escape route had disappeared from the tactical map. It was the kind of situation military academies love to discuss in classrooms because nobody expected to survive it in real life. Mason Walker stood in the operations center watching red markers slowly reposition themselves across the display. The enemy was not rushing. They were taking their time. That bothered him more than an attack would have. "They are enjoying this," Sarah said from across the room. Mason nodded. "That is the point. You think he wants us to panic?" "No," Mason replied. "I think he wants the galaxy to watch us panic." Sarah looked back at the growing cluster of enemy ships. "That sounds worse." A few feet away, communication specialists continued trying to reach Terran Command. Every attempt ended the same way. Static. Delays. Fragments of broken signals. Nothing useful. The blockade was working exactly as intended. Later that evening, Mason walked through the station's civilian section. Families filled the common areas. Some people played cards. Some pretended to watch old movies. Parents tried to act normal around their children. Nobody wanted to be the first person to admit they were afraid. A little girl sitting near a cafeteria window looked up as Mason passed. "Are we going home soon?" she asked. Her mother immediately looked embarrassed. "Sorry, Commander." Mason stopped anyway. He crouched beside the table. "What is your name?" "Megan." "Well, Megan, everybody here is working very hard to make sure you get home." That is not really an answer. For the first time all day, Mason smiled. "No, I guess it is not." The girl studied him carefully. "You do not look scared." Mason glanced through the window toward the distant stars. "That is because people need me to look calm." The answer seemed good enough for her. She nodded and returned to her tablet. As Mason continued down the corridor, Sarah caught up beside him. "You lied." "About what?" "Being calm." Mason laughed quietly. "I never said I was calm." Back in the command center several hours later, a sensor technician suddenly sat upright. "Commander, I have something strange." Mason approached immediately. "What kind of strange?" The technician enlarged a section of space near the outer edge of the system. 3 separate sensor sweeps picked up an unidentified signal pulse. Sarah frowned. "Enemy scout." "Maybe. Maybe not." The technician shook his head. "The signal appears for less than 2 seconds each time." Mason folded his arms. "Natural interference?" "That was my first guess." The technician hesitated. "But it repeats every 47 minutes." "Exactly." The room became quiet. Space was full of random noise. Random noise did not usually keep perfect time. Sarah looked at Mason. "You think somebody is trying to send us a message?" Before Mason could answer, another officer called from across the room. "Commander, incoming transmission from Karvek's flagship." Every conversation stopped instantly. The main screen activated. Warlord Karvek appeared seated comfortably in his command throne. He looked relaxed, confident, victorious. The expression of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. "Commander Walker," Karvek said, "I hope your accommodations remain acceptable." Mason stood motionless. "What do you want?" Karvek smiled. "A simple conversation. I am offering you an opportunity. Surrender the station. Spare your people unnecessary hardship. I can be generous." Nobody in the room spoke. Karvek continued. "You have 72 hours to make a decision." The transmission ended. The screen went dark. Sarah exhaled slowly. "What do we tell him?" Mason looked back toward the strange signal still blinking on the tactical display. A signal that should not exist. A signal arriving with impossible precision from somewhere beyond the blockade. Then he quietly said, "Nothing." "Nothing?" Sarah asked. Mason nodded. "Not yet." Across the room, the technician suddenly stared at his monitor. His eyes widened. "Commander," he whispered. "The signal just came back." Mason stepped closer. This time, everyone watched. The pulse flashed across the screen for less than 2 seconds before disappearing again. But now there was something different. Hidden inside the pattern was a sequence. Not random numbers. Not interference. Coordinates. Edit. The coordinates appeared and vanished so quickly that half the room thought they had imagined them. The sensor technician immediately replayed the capture. There they were again. A sequence of numbers embedded inside the pulse. Precise. Deliberate. Impossible. Sarah leaned closer to the display. Tell me somebody else is seeing this. We are all seeing it, Mason said quietly. The technician ran another analysis. The signal is coming from outside the blockade. That is not possible, another officer replied. Nothing gets through that fleet without being detected. Apparently something just did. The room fell silent. Mason studied the coordinates for several seconds before speaking. Plot them. A star map expanded across the tactical table. The coordinates pointed toward a region of empty space nearly 12 million miles beyond the outer edge of the system. There was nothing there. No station. No colony. No registered beacon. Just darkness. Maybe it is a trap, Sarah said. Maybe. Mason kept staring at the map. But if it is a trap, somebody went through a lot of trouble to get our attention. A young communications officer turned in his chair. Commander, there is something else. What? The signal pattern uses an old Terran military encryption layer. Sarah frowned. How old? The officer swallowed. 20 years. Several people exchanged confused looks. Most of the crew aboard Archer had never even heard of the encryption standard. It belonged to another era. Another generation of wars. Mason's expression changed slightly. Not fear. Not surprise. Recognition. Sarah noticed immediately. You know it. Mason looked away from the display. I used to. The room waited. After a moment he sighed. Back when I was a lieutenant. Nobody spoke. They all sensed there was more behind the answer. Much more. Hours later, long after the operations center had settled into uneasy quiet, Mason sat alone inside his office. The station lights were dimmed for night cycle. Outside the window, distant stars glowed against the blackness. He pulled open a small storage compartment built into his desk and removed an old photograph. Not a digital display. A real photograph. The edges were worn from years of handling. Emily stood beside him in front of a coastal cabin in Oregon. Wind pushed her hair across her face while she laughed at something the camera had failed to capture. Mason stared at the picture for a long time. You always knew when I was making a mistake, he murmured. The office remained silent. He could still hear her voice sometimes. Not literally. Just memories. Little things. Advice she had given years ago. Warnings he had ignored. Sarah knocked softly before entering. She immediately noticed the photograph. Sorry, she said. I can come back. No. What do you have? Sarah placed a tablet on the desk. I dug through archived fleet records. Mason looked up, and those coordinates showed up once before. For the first time all evening, his full attention locked onto her. When, 12 years ago, Sarah hesitated. During the Drake Corridor campaign, the room seemed to shrink. Mason slowly set the photograph down. He remembered that campaign. Every Terran veteran remembered it. Most preferred not to talk about it. Sarah lowered her voice. The same coordinates appeared in classified after-action reports. Mason stared at the screen. His pulse suddenly felt louder. That cannot be right. That is what I thought. Sarah looked uneasy. But there is one more thing. What? She took a breath. The reports were signed by Emily Walker. Mason froze. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Across the station, alarms remained silent. The blockade remained intact. Carvek's fleet continued circling patiently beyond the stars. But inside Mason's office, everything had just changed. Because somehow, after 12 years, his late wife's name had appeared at the center of a mystery that should not exist. Edit. Mason did not sleep that night. He sat in his office long after Sarah left, staring at the report on his screen. Emily Walker. Authorization signature confirmed. Classification level sealed. Timestamp, 12 years ago. It made no sense. Emily had never served in intelligence. She had been an engineer. A brilliant one, but still an engineer. Yet somehow her name was attached to files connected to the same coordinates now appearing beyond Carvek's blockade. Around 3 in the morning station time, Mason finally stood and walked to the archive terminal. Most of the records were restricted, but his command clearance opened a few more layers than before. Piece by piece, he started pulling files nobody had touched in years. The deeper he dug, the stranger it became. Entire sections were missing. Mission reports had been erased. Personnel lists had vanished. It looked less like a classified operation and more like somebody had deliberately buried its existence. By sunrise cycle, Sarah returned carrying 2 cups of coffee. She stopped when she saw the stack of reports covering Mason's desk. You have not been to bed. Mason accepted the coffee. Neither have you. Fair point. She pulled up a chair. Find anything? Mason slid a file across the desk. Sarah scanned the first page. Her eyebrows immediately rose. Project Horizon? Ever heard of it? No. Neither had I. Sarah continued reading. Why would an engineering task force need military encryption? That is exactly what I want to know. Before either could continue, alarms sounded across the station. Not emergency alarms. Communications alerts. Every screen in the command center flashed simultaneously. Mason and Sarah exchanged a look before hurrying toward operations. By the time they arrived, the entire bridge crew was staring at the main display. Karvek had begun broadcasting again. This time the message was not directed at Archer alone. It was being transmitted across the entire sector. The alien warlord appeared larger than life on every screen. Calm, confident, certain of victory. Citizens of the Outer Reach, he announced. Your leaders have abandoned you. Your defenders hide behind failing walls while your future slips away. There is still time to choose stability over chaos. Mason watched quietly as the speech continued. It was not a threat. That was what made it dangerous. Karvek was not trying to frighten people. He was trying to make surrender sound reasonable. Across the station, civilians gathered around public displays. Crew members listened in silence. Nobody liked hearing it, but everyone understood the reality behind the words. Supplies were low. Rescue seemed impossible. Hope was becoming harder to maintain. Sarah folded her arms. He is good at this. Mason nodded. That is why he keeps winning. Then one of the sensor technicians suddenly looked up from his console. Commander, what is it? The signal is back. Every head turned. The familiar pulse appeared again. Same frequency, same timing. But this time there was something new. The coordinates remained identical, yet another data string accompanied them. A short message hidden inside the transmission. The technician decoded it and read the words aloud. The room fell silent almost immediately. Sarah looked toward Mason. Mason looked at the screen. Neither spoke for several seconds. Because the message contained only 5 words. 5 words that should have been impossible. 5 words that appeared to come from a project erased from history. 5 words written under Emily Walker's authorization code. Do not let him leave. Edit. The words stayed on the screen long after the signal vanished. Do not let him leave. Nobody in the command center spoke for nearly 10 seconds. It was not because they did not understand the message. It was because they understood it too well. Sarah was the first to break the silence. Leave where? The sensor technician shook his head. No additional data. That is the entire transmission. Mason continued staring at the empty display. His mind was already moving through possibilities. The coordinates. Project Horizon. Emily's authorization code. Now a warning. None of it felt random anymore. Somewhere, someone was trying to tell them something important, and they were running out of time to figure out what it was. Pull every file connected to Horizon, Mason said. Everything. I do not care how old it is. The crew immediately got to work. Within an hour, dozens of archived reports filled the command network. Most were incomplete. Entire pages had been removed. Names were blacked out. Dates were missing. But a pattern slowly began to emerge. Horizon had never been an engineering project. At least not entirely. It had started that way. Then something changed. Sarah sat beside Mason reviewing one of the recovered reports. Look at this. She enlarged a section of text. The project was moved under Strategic Command Authority. Mason frowned. Engineering programs do not get transferred to military oversight unless somebody discovers something valuable. Or dangerous. Mason nodded. Or dangerous. Across the room, another officer suddenly called out. Commander, I found a surviving personnel roster. Mason walked over. The list contained only 7 names. 6 had retirement records. 1 did not. Mason immediately recognized it. Dr. Nathan Mercer. Sarah leaned over his shoulder. Still active? According to this file, yes. Where is he? The officer checked the database. His expression shifted. That is strange. What? Officially, he has been dead for 9 years. Sarah groaned. Of course he has. Mason almost smiled. It was the first normal thing anybody had said all day. Before they could continue, another transmission alert flashed across the command center. Karvek again. This time the alien warlord appeared from the bridge of his flagship. Behind him stretched a massive observation deck overlooking hundreds of ships. He looked completely relaxed. "Commander Walker," he said, "I am beginning to think you are ignoring my generous offer." Mason folded his arms. "Maybe I am busy." Several crew members fought back smiles. Karvek noticed. "Humor. Interesting." He slowly walked toward the camera. "Do your people still believe rescue is coming?" Nobody answered. Karvek continued. "You know the truth. Earth cannot reach you. The Council will not help you. Every hour you remain here only makes things harder for the civilians under your protection." The words landed harder than anyone wanted to admit, because they contained just enough truth to hurt. Mason remained calm. "If you have a point, get to it." Karvek's eyes narrowed slightly. "Very well. 48 hours. After that, events will move beyond your control." The transmission ended. Silence returned to the room. Sarah exhaled slowly. "He sounds confident." Mason looked toward the recovered Horizon files. Maybe he should not be. Then the communications console suddenly chimed again. Not from the blockade. Not from Karvek. The signal originated from the mysterious coordinates beyond the system. A new message appeared on screen. Only 3 words this time. 3 words that caused Mason's expression to change for the first time since the siege began. "Horizon is waiting." Edit. For the first time since the blockade began, Mason felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in days. Curiosity. Not hope. Not yet. Just curiosity. Horizon is waiting. The message lingered on the display while the command center tried to make sense of it. Sarah broke the silence first. "That sounds less like a warning and more like an invitation." Mason nodded slowly. "That is what worries me." Within the hour, every surviving Horizon file had been cross-referenced against military archives, engineering databases, and civilian records. The result was frustrating. Thousands of references existed. None explained what Horizon actually was. It was as if someone had spent decades erasing the answer while leaving clues behind. Then another breakthrough arrived. One of the analysts located a forgotten maintenance manifest connected to the original coordinates. The document was old, very old, yet one line immediately caught Mason's attention. "Facility status, dormant. Automatic systems operational. Awaiting activation authority." Sarah read the line twice. "Dormant facility? Looks that way. Out there." She pointed toward the coordinates beyond the blockade. Mason stared at the screen. Apparently, around them, crew members exchanged uncertain looks. Nobody liked mysteries appearing in the middle of a siege. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the system, Karvek's flagship continued broadcasting victory speeches. Across public channels, the Warlord spoke confidently about stability, order, and the inevitable future of the Outer Reach. Every transmission carried the same message. Resistance was pointless. The outcome had already been decided. Back aboard Archer, however, a different story was beginning to unfold. Several long-range sensors suddenly detected unusual movement near the blockade perimeter. Nothing dramatic, just small fluctuations, tiny inconsistencies, ships changing position unexpectedly, patrol routes adjusting without obvious reason. Sarah reviewed the data and frowned. Either they are searching for something, or they are nervous. Mason finished. Sarah looked surprised. "You think Karvek knows about Horizon?" Mason leaned back in his chair. "I think somebody sent us a warning telling us not to let him leave. That suggests Horizon matters to him." Before Sarah could respond, another encrypted report appeared on the main screen. The source code matched the earlier transmissions. The room immediately grew quiet. Everyone watched as the message decrypted itself. This one was longer. Not much longer. Just enough to raise even more questions. "Dr. Nathan Mercer. Clearance accepted. Await arrival." Sarah stared at the words. "The dead scientist." "Apparently not dead," Mason said. A young officer shook his head. "Commander, nobody survives 9 years off the grid without help." Mason looked toward the stars beyond the observation window. Then maybe he was never off the grid. Hours passed. The station remained surrounded. Supplies continued shrinking. Yet something subtle had changed among the crew. The atmosphere felt different. Less hopeless. Not because anyone expected a miracle. Because for the first time, there was a mystery bigger than the siege itself. Late that night, another sensor alert echoed across operations. The technician checked the readings twice before speaking. "Commander, I think you need to see this." Mason approached the display. The coordinates beyond the blockade were no longer empty. A faint energy signature had appeared, Weak, ancient, but unmistakably artificial. Sarah stared at the numbers. That facility. The technician swallowed. It just woke up. Edit. The energy signature continued growing throughout the next day. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to prove it was real. Every few hours the readings increased by a fraction. Every few hours another impossible piece of the puzzle fell into place. By now nobody aboard Archer doubted the facility existed. The only question was what it had been built for. Mason stood beside the sensor station, watching the latest update scroll across the display. Status? He asked. The technician adjusted several filters. The structure appears enormous. How enormous? The technician looked uncertain. Large enough that our systems keep flagging the measurements as errors. Sarah stepped closer. Try me. The technician swallowed. Based on the energy output, it could be larger than the station. Sarah stared at him. Archer is nearly 2 miles long. I know. Nobody said anything for several seconds. Out beyond the blockade, hidden in a region officially classified as empty space, something the size of a city appeared to be waking up. Meanwhile, Karvek's fleet continued its slow tightening maneuver around the system. Patrol routes shifted. Defensive formations adjusted. Long-range scans revealed ships moving toward strategic positions. It looked like preparation. Not for battle. For departure. Mason noticed it immediately. He is getting ready to leave. Sarah looked up from her tablet. You think that is why the warning said not to let him go? Maybe. Mason folded his arms. Whatever Horizon is, somebody believed Karvek could not be allowed to walk away from this system. Another transmission suddenly arrived from the coordinates. This one was different. No short message. No cryptic phrase. Instead, a compressed data package appeared inside Archer's communications buffer. The crew immediately isolated it and began decoding. The process took nearly 40 minutes. During that time, nobody left their station. Finally, the file opened. One image filled the main screen. An older man stared directly into the camera. Gray hair, weathered face, intelligent eyes. Sarah recognized him first. Nathan Mercer, the supposedly dead scientist. The recording began. If you are seeing this, then Horizon has activated. His voice sounded calm, matter of fact, like someone reading instructions rather than delivering a secret message. I do not know how much time remains. I do not know who commands the receiving station. But if the blockade is still active, then events are proceeding exactly as predicted. Mason exchanged a glance with Sarah. Predicted. The word landed heavily. Mercer continued. Many years ago, humanity discovered something hidden inside the frontier regions. Something older than any known civilization. Something powerful enough that every major government agreed to bury its existence. The command center became completely silent. We created Horizon to monitor it, protect it, and if necessary, contain it. Sarah whispered, contain what? As if hearing her question across time, Mercer paused before speaking again. The mistake was believing containment would always be possible. The recording abruptly ended. No explanation. No details. Just silence. Crew members immediately started talking over one another. Questions filled the room. Theories multiplied. Mason ignored all of them, because another alert had appeared on the tactical display. One of Karvek's major fleet groups had unexpectedly broken formation. The ships were moving. Not toward Archer. Not toward Earth. They were heading directly toward the coordinates. Toward Horizon. Sarah saw it too. Her expression darkened. He knows. Mason nodded slowly. For the first time since the siege began, genuine concern crossed his face. Because if Karvek had discovered Horizon's location, then whatever happened next was no longer about a trapped station. It was about a race. Edit. The race began 3 hours later. Nobody announced it. Nobody needed to. Every officer in Archer's command center could see the same thing unfolding across the tactical map. Karvek's ships were accelerating toward the coordinates. Whatever Horizon was, the Warlord had decided it mattered more than maintaining the blockade. Sarah stood beside Mason, watching red markers shift across the display. If he commits more ships, there will be gaps in the perimeter. Mason nodded. There will. Are we taking advantage of that? Mason did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the map. Not yet. Sarah sighed. You always say that right before something complicated happens. A few crew members laughed quietly. The tension inside the room had changed. The fear was still there, but now it had company. Curiosity. Determination. Maybe even a little optimism. For days they had been reacting to events. Now events were moving toward them. Another transmission arrived from the distant facility. This time the signal remained stable long enough for a direct communication channel to open. Static filled the speakers. Then a face appeared, older than in the archived recording. Thinner, tired, but unmistakably alive. Dr. Nathan Mercer looked directly into the camera. Nobody spoke. The scientist studied the room for a moment before finally breaking the silence. Well, you took longer than I expected. Sarah blinked. You are actually alive. I get that a lot. Mercer offered a faint smile. Mason stepped forward. Dr. Mercer, what is Horizon? The scientist's expression became serious. The reason humanity survived several wars nobody remembers. The room immediately fell silent again. Mercer continued. Years ago, explorers discovered something hidden beyond mapped space. Not a weapon. Not exactly. More like a system. A system for what? Sarah asked. For ending wars before they start. Nobody liked how vague that sounded. Mason folded his arms. That answer is not good enough. I know. Mercer nodded. But if I explain everything right now, half your crew will think I have lost my mind. Another alert suddenly flashed across Archer's consoles. Sensor officers immediately turned toward their screens. One of Carvec's lead formations had reached the outer edge of the coordinates. The first ships were entering the region surrounding Horizon. Mercer noticed the reaction instantly. How close are they? Too close, Mason replied. For the first time since appearing on screen, genuine concern crossed the scientist's face. Then we have a problem. Sarah looked at him. What kind of problem? Mercer exhaled slowly. The kind your wife warned us about. The room froze. Mason's eyes narrowed. You knew Emily. Of course I knew Emily. Mercer looked surprised. She helped design the safeguards. Mason felt the world tilt slightly beneath him. 12 years of unanswered questions suddenly seemed much closer than before. Then every display in the command center flashed white. A massive energy surge erupted from the coordinates. Not an explosion. Not an attack. Something else. Something awakening. Across the tactical map, dozens of Carvec ships abruptly halted their advance. For the first time since entering the system, the Warlord's fleet appeared uncertain. And somewhere aboard his flagship, Carvec was finally discovering that he had not been the only one moving pieces across the board. Edit. For a long moment, nobody aboard Archer said a word. The energy wave faded, but the silence it left behind felt even larger. Across the tactical display, Carvec's fleet remained frozen in place. Ships that had spent days advancing now held position as if waiting for instructions that never came. Mason looked at Dr. Mercer. Tell me what just happened. Mercer glanced towards something beyond his camera, then back to the screen. Horizon was never a fortress. It was never a secret weapon. Humanity built enough of those already. Sarah frowned. Then what is it? The old scientist smiled sadly. A reminder. That answer confused almost everyone except Mason. Somehow he already suspected the truth was going to be simpler than the myths surrounding it. Mercer continued. Long before your generation, people realized that every war begins the same way. Someone becomes convinced that power makes them right. Someone starts believing there are no consequences. Horizon was designed to prevent that. The tactical map shifted. New signals appeared around the system. Not battleships. Not defenses. Archives. Historical records. Diplomatic agreements. Thousands upon thousands of documents transmitted simultaneously across every civilian and military network in the sector. Sarah stared at the flood of information. What is all this? The truth, Mercer replied. Every hidden cost. Every forgotten mistake. Every civilization that collapsed because its leaders stopped listening. Even Carvec's public communication channels were receiving the data. Across the galaxy, billions of people suddenly gained access to records their governments had buried for centuries. Conquests that had failed. Empires that had vanished. Leaders who believed they could never lose. The pattern was always the same. Mason watched the information spread and finally understood why Emily had helped protect Horizon. It was not a machine built to destroy enemies. It was a system built to expose arrogance before arrogance destroyed everyone else. A new transmission suddenly appeared. Carvec himself. The Warlord looked different now. Not defeated. Just thoughtful. The kind of expression worn by someone seeing a road he should have noticed years ago. Commander Walker, he said quietly. Mason met his gaze. Warlord. Several seconds passed. Then Karvek looked away from the camera and toward the endless stream of records crossing his flagship's displays. I spent my entire life believing strength meant forcing the universe to move for me. Mason said nothing. Karvek gave a faint laugh. Turns out the universe has been keeping records. The transmission ended. Minutes later, sensor reports confirmed the first ships were leaving the blockade. Then another group. Then another. No grand surrender. No dramatic speech. Just a slow withdrawal from a conflict that suddenly seemed pointless. Around Archer, exhausted crew members began smiling for the first time in days. Some hugged. Others simply sat down and breathed. Mason remained by the observation window, overlooking the stars. Sarah joined him a few moments later. "You think this will last?" she asked. Mason considered the question. "Probably not forever." "That sounds pessimistic." "No." He shook his head. "Just human." Sarah laughed softly. Beyond the glass, the first clear route back to Earth opened across the darkness. Mason reached into his pocket and pulled out the old photograph of Emily. For years he had carried questions with no answers. Today he finally received one. Not about war. Not about strategy. About why she believed certain things were worth protecting. Some victories come from being stronger than your opponent. Others come from refusing to become the thing you are fighting. As the stars brightened beyond the station and the long siege quietly came to an end, Mason realized that was the lesson Horizon had been waiting all these years to teach. And perhaps that was why the most dangerous people were never the loudest ones. They were the people who still remembered that power means very little if you forget why you wanted it in the first place.